Dr. Martin Luther King on this significant day, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As we gather today, we're reminded of the courage, vision, and unwavering commitment of Dr. King and how he demonstrated this in pursuit of justice, equity, and for dignity of all people. His work continues to resonate deeply, and his call for a fierce urgency of now compels us, more than ever, to reflect on how we can carry forward his legacy in our own actions and our communities. So the World of Wellesley is primarily an educational nonprofit, and our mission is to foster an environment of belonging, equity, justice, not just here and not just today, but across every aspect of society. So Dr. King's vision is one of a beloved community where justice flows like a mighty river, and it continues to guide our work. But as we reflect on his life and his continuing legacy, we ask ourselves, or we must ask ourselves, how can we move beyond the ideal of an equitable society and make it a reality today? What will each of you do over the course of this year as a call to action? Today's conversation will center on many important questions. What does it mean to resist injustice in all its forms? How can we ensure that everyone, regardless of race, gender, class, or background, can access the same opportunities for justice and success? How do we reconcile Dr. King's message of urgency with the complex, multifaceted realities that we face today? So as we engage in today's discussion, I encourage each of you to think about how we can continue to honor Dr. King's work and vision by taking action in ways that matter in this moment. So I'm hoping that together we'll continue to reflect, discuss, and act. With that, I'm very excited to introduce our celebrity keynote speaker, Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson. It's just fabulous. We're so excited to have gotten her here today for this. So Dr. Carter Jackson is the Michael and Denise 68 Associate Professors of Africana Studies and the chair of the Africana Studies Department here at Wellesley College. She's the author of We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance, and the award-winning book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Nonviolence. Her essays have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Nation, Boston Globe, CNN, and a host of other outlets. She co-hosts 2 podcasts, and she's been featured in numerous documentaries on Netflix, PBS, MSNBC, CNN, and the list goes on. Good Morning America, don't forget Good Morning America. So Dr. Carter Jackson has served as a historian in residence for the Museum of African American History in Boston and is a commissioner for the Massachusetts Historical Commission as well. And she lives somewhere out here in the suburbs of Boston with her husband and 3 kids. So big hand of applause, warm welcome for Dr. Carter Jackson.
Grateful to be here with the World of Wellesley. This is fantastic. It's even better to be here, right, at Wellesley College. Like, this is my second home. The Africana Studies Department is not far away. We start classes tomorrow. And so I'm already kind of dreading. I know there's students here. I'm like, oh, we're starting back already. Does anybody else feel like that? I feel like that. But for the rest of the world, for people who don't have long winter breaks, people are like, you've been at work for weeks. I'm like, all right, fair enough. So I want to share stories with you today. I tell people that I wear a lot of hats. I tell people I have like 10 jobs, which I do. And I'm also, actively parenting a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old. I'm chronically tired, it's all good. But I really want people to know me as a storyteller, and so, or as a historian, perhaps more formally. So I'm going to share some stories from my book, Today we refuse, and then I'm looking forward to a really good Q&A conversation afterwards. So let's get started. This is Arnesta Duncan. This is my great-grandmother. And when my great-grandmother Arnesta was 9 years old, she stepped on a rusty nail. Not long after, infection began to set in. She likely contracted tetanus, a serious bacterial infection that can lead to painful muscle spasms and death if left untreated. Her mother, Mary Bullard, was frantic. Arnesta was her only child, and she was going to lose her if she did not act fast. So Mary sent Arnesta to the only doctor she knew, a white man who lived in a big house on the other side of town. The white doctor offered to help Arnesta, but in exchange, she would have to live with him for the rest of her life, working for his family. Growing up black and a girl in 1915 in rural Alabama left her vulnerable. During one of the worst periods of race relations in America, these were the detestable but predictable terms of engagement. Mary, panic-stricken and not wanting to lose her daughter to death, agreed. Thankfully, Arnesta's grandmother, a former slave, and this is really interesting because for the longest time in my book, I didn't know who Arnesta's grandmother was. I didn't have a name for her. And then over the Thanksgiving holidays, I found out that her name was Martha. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have a name. So now I'm trying to get the publisher to put it in the book. But I also found out something interesting, that Martha's only daughter was Mary. And Mary's only daughter was Arnesta. And Arnesta's only child was Edward. And Edward's only child was Revella. And Revella had 7 children, and I'm number 6. So pretty crazy there. But thankfully, Arnesta's grandmother, a former slave, intervened and refused the doctor's proposal. She picked up her ailing granddaughter and took her home. I imagine she went to her cupboard, but perhaps more likely her garden, and there she administered every natural remedy at her disposal. Arnesta survived, but for the rest of her life she walked with a limp. Whatever space she entered, whatever path she took, she was marked by a violent racial imprint. My mother told me this story as a child to explain my great-grandmother's limp. But it was not until I was an adult that I realized that the rusty nail was not only the root of her trauma. This story has always gripped me for a couple of reasons. First, Arnesta was a child, and her mother's only child. How could a doctor refuse a dying child medical care when it was in his ability to heal her? He had abandoned his oath. First, do no harm. Second, nearly 50 years outside of slavery, white folks still felt entitled to black labor and life in perpetuity. Clearly, everything was transactional to this white doctor. Built into the deal he offered was a lifetime of servitude and likely physical and sexual abuse. Sometimes, I think white supremacy in America can be summed up by these 2 diabolical options: to live a life in bondage, or refuse and limp. To be black in America is to live life with a limp. My great-grandmother's outcome had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with power. The power of the white doctor to neglect and attempt to exploit a little black girl who came to him for help. But my book is not about the white doctor or people like him. In many ways, Refuse is about my great-great-great-grandmother's response, Martha's refusal. It is about her rescue to save my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, myself, and even my daughters. Her refusal was not just no. It was never. Refusal is a forceful no. It is a no that is packed full of energy and meaning. We refuse is similar to black colloquialisms such as nah, or nope, or not today, Satan, or my personal favorite, oh hell no. I was recently asked about the difference between resistance and refusal. For me, resistance is how one responds to white supremacy, but refusal is why. Refusal abhors oppression and insists on defining how humanity should be understood and treated with respect, dignity, and decency. Non-verbally, refusal is a halting hand or a pointed finger waving from side to side or a powerful raised fist. It is a barrier that prevents oppressed people from being consumed. Refusal can be enacted by an individual, but at its heart, refusal is collective. Which is why the sentiment behind the phrase, "we refuse," persists among subjugated people and is a key refrain in Black feminist politics as well as Native politics. Black women have refused to be invisible or small. And this entire book consists of examples of Black people refusing lies, violence, theft, mockery, or second-class citizenship. It shows how our refusal denies whiteness and white supremacy their unearned power and authority. Since the 16th century, Black history has become a history of refusal. So last summer, I took my first trip to Ghana, and I traveled to the Gold Coast of Elmina to visit one of the largest slave dungeons there that was built by the Portuguese. And on a wall, in a cell, just adjacent to where they kept rebellious Africans who they left to die a slow death, is a plaque. And on it reads, "We are the children of those who refuse to die. We are the children of those who refuse to die." From the moment the slave ships left the coast of Africa for the New World, Black people refused to die. And even some forfeited their lives because they refused to live in the conditions created by their white captors. In the 17th century, Queen Anna Njinga, the Kingdom of Ndongo, present-day Angola, refused the terms and broken treaties of the Portuguese and fought for decades against the enslavement of her people. In the 18th century, people like Elizabeth Freeman, who upon hearing the Declaration of Independence read out loud, refused to be denied her right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. As an enslaved person living in the state of Massachusetts, she took to the courts and sued for her freedom and won. In the 18th century, or in the 19th century, Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 was a collective refusal. During the uprising, enslaved people killed nearly 60 men, women, and children. They killed their enslavers because they refused to be kept in bondage. They killed white children because they refused to let them perpetuate the system by growing up to become slaveholders. Enslaved people refused to be enslaved even when their efforts to gain freedom failed. Even Black children refused. During the 1950s and 60s, the American flag was used as a symbol in the Civil Rights Movement. In a sea of Confederate flags all throughout the South, the American flag reminded the nation that Black people were Americans. Here, 5-year-old Anthony was protesting alongside his mother for her right to vote in Mississippi. Turned away from seeing the governor, an officer attempted to snatch Anthony's flag from his hand. His mother called to him, "Anthony, don't let that man take your flag. Anthony, don't let that man take your flag." These are the stories of Black women and men and children who refused white supremacy. So a word on nonviolence. We Refuse offers a fundamental shift in how we understand and talk about Black people's responses to white supremacy. Often, when Black people are up against white violence, society presents them with two options. Are you going to be violent, like Malcolm X, or are you going to be nonviolent, like MLK? Are you going to burn it all down, or are you going to forgive? These are the choices, violence or nonviolence. And nonviolence has been based on the principle that one can morally persuade their oppressor to have a pang of consciousness or conviction regarding their wrongness. Nonviolence uses compassion, empathy, and morality to compel another's humanity. But I take issue with how the binary of nonviolence and violence has controlled the praxis and narrative by which oppressed people combat their oppression. Nonviolence on its own is not expansive enough to rectify the harm that has been caused by racism. And promoting and celebrating nonviolence as the only acceptable form of resistance is rife with handicaps. For example, while my ancestor, Martha's remedy for Ernesta, might fall under the category of nonviolence, since no one physically harmed the doctor for making his proposal, my ancestor's refusal was complex, and it was too reductive to throw it in a pile labeled nonviolence. My ancestors' refusal was complicated. First, she refused the doctor's offer. Then, she sought every natural remedy she possessed to stop the infection and heal Ernesta's body. She did not plead or bargain with the doctor. She did not try to convince him that Ernesta was a child or human. Her refusal, remedy, and protection transcended violence or nonviolence. She took the doctor out of the equation. The doctor had no compassion for the child. He could not be morally persuaded. Violence against him would have been a death sentence for all of them, but nonviolence would have ensured my great-grandmother's death. White supremacy and anti-blackness are always violent, and the constant refrain is for the harmed to forgive violence, forget injury, forfeit their agency. But sisters and brothers and siblings, today I come to tell you we have more than two options. Black people need not choose between certain death and life in bondage. We have, throughout history, approached such violence with an array of responses and refusals. So for a very long time, our only model has been that of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And many of King's beliefs had been diluted at best or perverted at worst. American society presents a whitewashed nonviolence that often speaks nothing of white supremacy, capitalism, or militarism, the three things that King fought for all of his life. I often find that King's beliefs were not wrong, but merely incomplete. They do not always encompass the full range of human responses that people engage in, particularly in the face of death. King's 6 principles do not address reparations, which may not be purely monetary, but how to repair the harm of white supremacy. How do people heal? Not after breaking a bone or stepping on a rusty nail, but after losing a loved one, or losing land, wealth, or health, or after psychological trauma. And in a spiritual and secular sense, King's 6 principles do not address repentance. What does it look like to turn from the ways of an oppressor? What does it look like to relinquish power? These missing principles are what activists today are still trying to navigate. Not how we employ Black harm for transformation, but how do we mitigate harm altogether? Today, nonviolence has dwindled down to marches. And when a Black man or woman or child is killed by racial violence, people march. But marches do not keep Black people alive. Marches honor the dead. Marches are public mourning, not public policy. And whenever racial altercations gain traction in the media, pundits and politicians alike are quick to point to King as the model for doing protests the right way. After racial violence results in death, the media's question is, will the protest be peaceful? Or an even more egregious question, does the victim's family forgive the perpetrator? Marches, forgiveness, and peaceful protests are all shorthand for calls back to King. But nonviolence today means something different than what King intended. Now it is a performance of passive power that almost ensures that those in power never structurally change. White supremacy does not believe in nonviolence because it does not believe in Black humanity. And to white supremacy, nonviolence is a scarecrow. And racists rest like crows on its outstretched arms. Nonviolence alone could never sufficiently frighten or endanger political, economic, or social institutions. So a word now on violence. Violence is the engine of white supremacy. Violence is an entire ecosystem. Violence is a tool employed to harm, deny, restrict, neglect, separate, and deceive. Notably, it can be a means to various ends. It can be used to enforce white supremacy or to overthrow a government. Violence is slavery and segregation. Violence is theft and hoarding. Violence is replacing the truth with conspiracy. Violence is rupture and separation. Violence occupies the space of a system, an ideology, a culture, and a language. Violence can take many forms, and Black people spend much of their lives, if not their entire lives, avoiding, subverting, addressing white violence. And it is impossible to write a book that offers a critical analysis on violence and does not interrogate white supremacy as the lead perpetrator. We demand that people of color remain nonviolent, but we fail to ask the most important question. Why are white Americans so violent? Why are white Americans so violent? I want to be clear. We Refuse is not about advocating violence, but I'm encouraging leaders to grapple with the causes and the consequences of it, to think outside of the binary of violence and nonviolence. The refusals and remedies offered are equally not about revenge. The work of revenge is ridiculous. Consider this: never have Americans ever heard of black men bombing a white church and killing 4 little white girls. Never have Americans ever heard of a black man assassinating a white man in his driveway in front of his family, like they did Medgar Evers. Never have Americans ever heard of a black man being invited into a white church for a prayer meeting where they treated him kindly and then gunned down the white churchgoers. Never have Americans ever heard of a black mob attempting to overthrow the elected government of the United States at the Capitol. Vengeance is a white imaginary project. Only in fiction or film could we conjure a story where black people take white folks hostage and blow up police precincts and kill white people. Black people are not consumed with revenge, but justice. And white people are not afraid of revenge, they are afraid of justice, because justice is more costly. Violence harms everyone, even white people. I tell the story about my great-grandfather, James Price. Him and his wife, Rosa, had 16 children together, and they lived in Darlove, Mississippi. And I told my mom, I was like, 16 children? She was like, well, he actually had 19. He had 3 before Grandma Rosa. I was like, oh my gosh, 19 children. He used to joke when they were in their 70s, I could have some more. And she was like, oh my God. But he and his wife, Rosa, had 16 children together. And they lived in Darlove, Mississippi. And they all picked cotton. It was the 1930s. And one day, while James was driving his car, a little white boy darted out in front of him and was killed instantly. The accident happened in broad daylight, and there were many witnesses. In any other scenario, my grandfather would have been lynched on the spot. His family would have been exiled, if not violently attacked. Sorry, I lost my place. His family would have been exiled, if not violently attacked. James was terrified. But word quickly spread around town that while James had killed this little boy, it was an accident. He and his family were not to be harmed. Even the boy's family defended James. My family said it was a miracle. Only the Lord. The town said it was James' upstanding character and his reputation as a good man. I suspect the truth is more sinister. James, Rosa, and their 16 children were cheap, reliable labor during the height of the Great Migration. Here's the thing, capitalism is also violence. It makes even little white boys who get in the way expendable. And this year, many white people and those who aspire to whiteness will find out just how expendable they are. My great-grandfather was not being protected. He was being exploited. The white boy who got caught in the cogs of capital missed a valuable lesson. In this white supremacist capitalist world, the boy should have looked both ways. Whiteness and capitalism are not compelled with suffering, but consumed with inflicting it. White supremacy in its core, in its manifestations, is violence. And building on Toni Morrison's 1975 Portland State University speech, in which she said racism is a distraction because it keeps you from doing your work, literary critic Sandy Alexander described the anti-black racism that arises from white supremacy as not merely a thorn in a person's side, but also a suffocating knee on a person's neck. And during the summer of 2020, she argued racism was so distracting, it deprioritized prioritize a whole global pandemic. She says racism has been so flagrantly murderous that it has absolutely no qualms about being caught on camera. In fact, she says, it will pose for it. We Refuse focuses on how Black people respond to white supremacy, and it reframes the conversation away from the rightness or wrongness of nonviolence, and instead focuses on what works. I focus on Black women because I'm in agreement with the Combahee River Collective, which states, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. We Refuse examines 5 ways that Black women and men have successfully engaged white supremacy beyond nonviolence. I study revolution, protection, force, flight, and joy. And I readily admit that even these broad categories are not exhaustive, but in We Refuse, I hope to uncover them as a set of possibilities among many. For me, revolution is about forfeiture, about a new beginning, as we've seen in the Haitian Revolution. It's about replacing broken systems with just ones. When I think about protection, I think it's best understood in the efforts of the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement. Black people protected friends and family members and fugitives from the violence of slavery and the snare of slave catchers. Force looks at how Black people employed their Second Amendment rights to protect themselves from the violence of the Klan. And flight looks at how Black people who left, maybe temporarily or maybe forever, but always in search of belonging. And lastly, I study the potency of joy. I contend that the opposite of violence is not nonviolence. In America, the opposite of violence is the fullness of Black humanity bound together with joy. I chose these 5 categories of Black response because throughout my life, I have researched or witnessed or experienced the utility of them all. Their impacts can blend into one another. Sometimes revolutions involve force. Sometimes flight is motivated by protection. Sometimes flight and force are joyful. Many will remember the viral footage of a brawl that took place in Montgomery, Alabama at a riverfront park in August of 2023. And actually, I remember this vividly because I was in Ghana. I was on a plane getting ready to fly back home. And all of a sudden, my phone started blowing up. And my friend is like, are you watching this? Are you watching this? I was like, watching what? I don't know what you're talking about. They're like, go to Twitter right now. And I noticed that a Black dock worker was attacked by several white men who refused to abide by his instructions to move their boat. The white attackers shoved the Black man and began to overwhelm him. But in minutes, dozens of nearby Black men and women joined the fight to help the dock worker by jumping on white assailants and landing blows, including one teenager who jumped from a boat and swam to a dock to defend him, and another man who picked up a folding chair to attack folks who were trying to defend himself from attacking and harming more white people. Within hours, the internet exploded with GIFs and jokes and memes and reenactments and even merch to celebrate the Black resistance to white violence. One white man was dragged to the point where his Crocs became socks. My personal favorites were Fade in the Water, referring to the 16-year-old as Malcolm Phelps and Aquaman, and a quote by Shirley Chisholm that said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. I recently found out, too, that the folding chair was actually invented by a Black man, Nathaniel Alexander, in 1911. I was like, of course we invented the folding chair. Collectively, both in person and virtually, Black people were refusing violent treatment of white voters. Black people not only rejected their ill treatment, they protected each other. They used force to stop their attackers. They ran toward trouble, and they celebrated, laughed, and memorialized Black refusal with relentless joy and mockery. Poking fun at whiteness robs it of its legitimacy. Humor undoes the authority of white supremacy. It reveals its irrationality. The lessons of refusal and joy were bound up on that Alabama dock. The initial response to an altercation like Montgomery is anger. Don't dismiss this. Theologian James Cone contended anger and humor are like the left and right arm. They complement each other. Anger empowers the poor to declare their uncompromising opposition to oppression, and humor prevents them from being consumed by their fury. A deep, nuanced conversation on the history and implications of white violence is overdue. We have failed to examine the violence that Black people are responding to in their communities. We have dismissed the rock thrower, the looter, the graffiti artist, and the poet. Not all Black responses are violent, but not all Black responses are nonviolent either. And throughout history, Black people have employed a plethora of tools to combat anti-Blackness. And these categories do the work of expanding nonviolence and in some cases giving credence to force when it works. Liberation is forceful, but that does not make it illegitimate. It simply makes it hard. My great-great-great-grandmother refused the metaphorical fork in the road. She stomped out a new trail for our nesta. She rejected dehumanization. Understanding a different path forward means asking different questions and being willing to accept hard solutions. If you are like me today, you might be thinking about the state of the world, the state of politics, the inauguration, Gaza, Haiti, Sudan, academia, the state of climate, the healthcare system, the state of our prisons, the state of our educational system, and you might be angry. You should be. Anger is useful. Audre Lorde said, anger prevents you from being stagnant and resigned. Anger is the engine of refusal. But our anger should never be left alone. It must be tethered to hope, and hope is tethered to joy. And hope and joy stem from a place of purpose and promise. Wendell Berry is a writer and environmental activist, and he argues that when it comes to fixing societal problems, people often want a solution as large scale as the problem. But rarely can any major problem ever be solved in this way. Instead, he suggested what is needed is countless small solutions that can chip away at the core issues. But small interpersonal solutions do not satisfy Americans' need for drama. At a surface level, refusal and joy does not feel adequate. At best, it can feel dismissive, at worst, like salt in a wound. But refusal is not a simple declaration. It is a verb. Moreover, joy is not mere optimism, nor is it ease. It is a conviction that nothing big or small can be tackled without first believing it is possible. I think about the small but powerful ways we can refuse and find joy to combat violent systems. So there's a quote that I have here by MLK that I stumbled upon actually like a few days ago. And I felt like it was appropriate for today because I feel like it encapsulates what King might even say. And I would hate to put words in his mouth, but these are his words. He says, "These are revolutionary times, facts. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and to go out into a sometimes hostile world declaring eternal opposition to poverty and racism and militarism." And I think that word is perfect, but I think what's even better is to also think about something that King did that we never talk about, that we never see, and that's joy. I found these pictures of MLK on vacation in Jamaica. Have y'all seen this? You should Google MLK Jamaica. Like, you see him shirtless, oh my gosh, you see him shirtless, swimming in a pool, walking on the beach with Coretta, holding hands, relaxing. And it's in this space, in this moment, where he says, in Jamaica, I feel like a human being. And I thought about the principle of flight, of what it means to run away, to go away, to get a reprieve, but always to come back, to get rest and then be ready to tap back into the struggle, to tap back into the fight. So I want to close, but I want to end with returning to my great-grandmother, Ernesta, because I told you that she limped. What I didn't tell you was that the limp was not the totality of her. She lived, she loved, she actually married 5 times. She laughed. This is her and my grandfather in the kitchen. She left Alabama and moved to Michigan. She protected her family as best she could. She poured into the lives of others and into the life of my mother. This is my mother here when she's about 3 years old. She refused, and in her refusal, she found joy. Thank you.
We are. Okay, I'm going to open it up for a little bit of Q&A. So anybody want to start us off with questions? Please.
Thank you. I'm from the League of Women Voters, and our study this year is about reparations for Black Americans. And I wondered if you had any comments, any historical context for us.
Yes. Actually, I love a good podcast. I did a podcast with WBR not too long ago called What is Owed? And it's about reparations here in Boston. Well, not here in Boston, but here in the Boston area. And then I'm actually on the commission, the New Jersey Commission and Council for Reparations. And me and a bunch of other scholars are writing the historical context for slavery in New Jersey. I think oftentimes people think of the North and they don't think of slavery or slavery persisting very long. But the last people were actually freed in the United States, not in Juneteenth, not in Galveston, Texas, but actually in New Jersey in 1866 when they finally ratified the 13th Amendment. About over 100 people were still enslaved in New Jersey. New Jersey held on the longest out of all the slave states. And so we're looking at writing up this context and getting people to understand what is sort of the larger understanding of not only our grip and allegiance to slavery, but how that played out with Jim Crow segregation, with mass incarceration, with housing, with health inequities. And so now when I think about reparations, I think of it in a much more expansive way. I don't think of it as just cutting checks. I think of it as how do we repair the harm? How do you fix things that have been lost and broken? How do you restore what has been taken away? And for me, it feels like a much bigger project, but I'm actually encouraged. I do feel hopeful. I don't know if it will happen in my lifetime, but there are activists and scholars and community activists doing this work to really bring about solutions. And it might be smaller scale, right? It might go back to what I quoted Wendell Irwin Phillips about, that sort of chipping away at it. It might look something like that, like small pockets like we've seen in Evanston or in other places where people have attempted to try to repair the harm that's been done. But I believe in it, and I think there's a historical precedent for it. We have tons of cases in which people have gotten reparations, both Black and Native American and Japanese American and Jewish American. So we have a precedent for it. We actually have a model for it. We just have to have the courage to implement it. Mm-hmm.
Hold on.
Excuse me.
Thank you very much, Professor Jackson. That was very inspirational. And it may be that you'll respond that the answer to my question was in your presentation, but I'm going to ask the question anyway.
Yeah.
You may have noticed that a person has become president of the United States who has a history that's not quite consistent with what Dr. King and many of us have been aspiring to for the country. And the question has arisen, how should we as people who continue to believe that all human beings are born as children of God with dignity and grace and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
How should we respond to this administration?
I say we refuse. I mean, I've been talking about refusal all day, but I mean, that is, and I think that takes on a myriad of forms, right? What refusal looks like for me is going to look different for other people. You know, what I'm most concerned right now, and this is because it's my bread and butter, you know, I am worried about the classroom, I'm worried about textbooks, I'm worried about DEI, I'm worried about scholars losing their jobs even when they have tenure, I'm worried about K through 12 teachers that are being fired and losing their jobs, I'm worried about an assault on education and a culture that is anti-intellectual. That is terrifying to me. And though I know that not everybody is going to go to college, like knowledge and the pursuit of truth is worthy no matter where you are in your life. And so those are the things that I work really hard for. I'm actively thinking about what my next book is going to be, because for me, like, the pen is my sword. I write books and I give lectures, and that is how I refuse. And so I'm thinking about, like, what are ways that we can sort of be creative and be strategic and not always be on the defense, but be on the offense. How can we protect people? How can we, you know, think about revolution in a way that is transformative, that brings about change? And I'll be honest, I'm not super hopeful. Like, I had thought that this would be a different outcome, that we would be celebrating a different moment. And I have to remember that as a historian, you know, backlash is always going to be there. You get progress, you get backlash. You get progress, you get backlash. But that doesn't mean that progress is not going to happen. It just means it's going to take more work to get there. It's going to take more effort to get there. And that progress is not inevitable. We can't rest. We can't sort of, like, you know, hang out and say, well, somebody's going to do it. Well, somebody is going to get to it. Well, he wouldn't do that. And we can't rest on that. That is not going to save any of us. So yeah, I tell my students I want them to be student activists. And they're like, you want us to get arrested? And I'm like, no, please don't get arrested. When I say I want you to be student activists, I mean, I want you to act on what you know. I want you to take all of this history and knowledge that you are getting and let it inform how you vote, where you work, where you buy a home, where you put your kids in school, who you hire, who you fire. Like, the work that you do in your life, your knowledge should be activating you to do something. To not just be anger and, you know, upset and then not do anything with that. So that's going to look different for everyone. But I will also be honest, I don't have a 3-point plan, right? I don't have, like, we will solve racism by 2026. That is not me. But I do think, I mean, Barry is right. We got to chip away at it. Little, tiny, small solutions in our communities, you know, at the local level, at the state level, and then at the national level. But we can't stop.
Anybody else? Quick question? Students? We have a bunch of students in the house today. Any questions?
My question is, like, your speech is really good, but how do you how do you address, like, stereotypes in the classroom today, like, for students of color in this story? Like, how do it affect the students in the classrooms today?
That's a really good question. First, I just want to say thank you, because your table is like my main corner. Like, every time I looked at y'all, you were like, yes, it was very helpful. As a speaker, I appreciate that. Stereotypes in the classroom. The thing about stereotypes is that they don't really take a whole lot to dismantle them. You know, you can pop a stereotype pretty easily. Because stereotypes are based off, you know, generalities. You know, you can have a stereotype about, you know, black people being violent or being criminal or being lazy, and you can combat that pretty easily. It actually doesn't take much. Sometimes your very existence defies the stereotype. And I think that that's something that a lot of students of color struggle with when they get to PWIs, predominantly white institutions, is belonging. Is how am I going to belong in this institution? And I encourage students, take up space. Like, you are paying to be here. Even if you're on scholarship, you are still paying to be here. And take up as much space as you absolutely can. Own that space. And do incredibly well. One of the things that a lot of scholars talk about in the early 19 teens and 20s was that Black excellence defied the myth of white supremacy. So that the more excellent you were, the more sort of talented you were, the more you popped holes in the idea that whiteness was supreme or that whiteness was superior. And I believe that to some extent. I also think that true liberation comes in being able to be mediocre. True liberation is if you can be basic, so can I, right? We're human beings. That should be the ultimate liberation. So I say a little bit of balance that. Be excellent in your classrooms. Be excellent for your professors. Do well. Study hard. But also know that you alone are not going to save us. You alone are not going to alter the universe. The only thing you can do is the best you can right in the space that you are. And your presence matters greatly. So take up space. Okay, maybe you'll be the last one.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Great speech. I'm curious about two parts. I'm curious about this idea, as we listen to this. You seem like you're saying that there's a danger in the single story about our capacity, our humanity, and our relationships. And so one of the questions I'm curious about is, how have you been able to move past these single stories of weakness, of defeat, of these binaries, of being able to see the fullness of people? So that's one part.
Yeah.
And the second part of the question I have is, I was told, or reading history, that in these moments of great distress, so much creativity and transformation happened when we look at the Harlem Renaissance, after World War II. And I'm wondering, how do we tap into the recognition that this is part of a cycle, but there's great possibility that can come through this, but it requires something more than what we're used to.
Yes, that's my second book, yes. Next book right here. So I'll answer the first question. So on the first day of class, whatever I'm teaching, if it's Introduction to the Black Experience or African American History, I push back on this idea of the danger of the single story. If you've never seen Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk on the danger of the single story, so worth your 18 minutes. It's very, very good. And basically it's this idea that we get the same story over and over and over and over again. And that is what history becomes to us. It becomes very flat, very one-dimensional. So we get King had a dream, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. We have these ideas about either Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. And they're very simplistic and they're very simple and very flat. And we get those handful of stories over and over and over again to the point where we think that's all Black history is. And so I work really hard to push against that, to combat that idea. So I want my students to have a diversity of stories, a range of stories. And I even tell them, my class is still one-dimensional. We only have 16 weeks. I can't give you an exhaustive Black history experience. I have them do student presentations because I want them to teach the class something that we don't know. I have two goals when I teach. One is to give my students something new, and two is to give them something new that what they think they know, but they don't. So it feels like renewed information. And I think it's good to be reminded about the heroes that we think we know, but then I always try to give you something different with that person. So that's something I'm always thinking about in my class. And shout out to my students, because it's my students that really compelled me to push back against binaries. These binaries don't serve us. And not just talking about gender, but the idea of it's good, it's bad, it's right, it's wrong, it's black, it's white. The world does not operate like that. We need a much more expansive way of being able to exist and be. So yeah, I've never known a binary that has served me well. And then when it comes comes to like, in terms of, I think of historical precedent, like how do we go back in time? When I say this is my next book, that's exactly what I'm thinking about. It's like, I want to be able to go back to like the period of Reconstruction, where you get like great progress, you get all these constitutional amendments, you have all of this like movement to do right by Black people, and then there's a swift and violent backlash. And then when you think about that period, which scholars call this the nadir, it's like a 40-year period of like the 1880s and the 1920s. It's the worst, not just for Black people, like it's the worst for women, it's the worst for labor. This is the height of the Gilded Age, this is the age of robber barons, this is the height of anti-immigration sentiment, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act happens at this point. Like everyone is getting their clocks clean, everyone. And yet, in every single circumstance, there is a woman, there is a man, there is a person that pushes back on that law or policy or social idea. You also get the progressive era in the 1920s, this movement where people are like, we are going to end poverty. You get the women's movement to get women enfranchised with the vote. You have people like Ida B. Wells that are doing investigative journalism, that are trying to undermine lynching all across the country. You have courageous, brave people that are finding other coalitions of courageous, brave people and are partnering together to create the world that we benefit from now in this very moment. So I want to find those people and then to put them up as examples and to say like, listen, if this is what they did in 1889, or if this is what they did in 1903, how much more can we do? How much more are we empowered with all of the technology and all of like the communication that we have? What can we do? You know, the abolitionists, they did a lot with pen and paper. Like their newspapers were transformative. Slave narratives, just Black people telling their story, changed the abolitionist game. The pen is a powerful tool for me. I don't think it can ever be underestimated. So these are the things that I think about when I think about where we go forward. And even though part of me is very discouraged about where we are, there's a small part of me that's like, remember your history, remember your training. There are always people doing good work. There are always people fighting the fight. There are always people sacrificing and willing to even put their lives on the line. There are always people like that. And contrary to popular belief, they are not as few and as small as we think they are. And even if they are, I'll give you another piece of encouragement. When I think about the abolitionists, my first book was on the abolitionists. The abolitionists were 1% of the population. 1% of the population. And they dismantled this whole system, like completely dismantled a whole system. You don't get the abolition of slavery without the abolitionist movement, without people like Frederick Douglass and people like William Lloyd Garrison and people like Mariah Stewart and David Walker and Sojourner Truth, and I could go on and on. These people did that work, and they didn't have large numbers, and they didn't have a lot of money, and they changed the United States forever. We can do that too.
Thanks, folks. Now we're going to transition over to